what I've said in the vlog before of I want to do multiple or like different types of content, and this one is more or less a podcast, but more in the vein of like we like to watch movies and we like to talk about movies.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is going to be our first TV and movie thing that we're doing, and this is all going to be about Westworld, and I'm going to be your host, Brian, and then I have sitting across from me is...
I'm Kalani. Hi.
And we're going to talk about the first episode of Season 2 of Westworld, and we're going to try to make sure this is less than 15 minutes. There's a lot to talk about. I think maybe the first thing we should get into is probably maybe a recap of Season 1.
Right.
So do you want to do it, or do you want me to do it?
We could both try to do it.
Okay.
The general gist of what Westworld is that it starts off as a show about a theme park where there are a whole bunch of people who they call hosts. Mm-hmm. Who are basically robots, mm-hmm. right? And they basically play like the animatronic role, like if you're talking like Five Nights at Freddy's, and they're not real, and mm-hmm. you can basically do anything in this park. You can have sex, you can go kill things. You basically are allowed to do anything that in the real world would be considered illegal, and you're free to do it at any time, at any point.
It's kind of like without consequence.
Basically, yeah. And so as a guest, you pay thousands, upwards into millions of dollars to get into this park.
Yeah, per day.
Per day,
it's
which
like
is
$10,000 per day, right?
I think so.
First season?
I think so. It's pretty expensive. Yeah. And then they get to go to this park and they get to experience a whole bunch of things, such as like going onto these different narratives with different hosts. Mm-hmm. You get introduced to this one character named Delores, who is basically the oldest host in the park.
Right.
And she, in the show, predominantly is seen as the one who is the closest to gaining consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then you're introduced to all the other characters. Like, you have Teddy, who's her kind of, like, star-crossed lover.
It's kind of, like, scripted.
Right.
Like, love interest.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we kind of get lead on to.
Right, yeah. And the show progresses into a point where you start understanding how the hosts are trying to gain consciousness.
Right.
And they have to follow this thing, which I believe Ford, the creator of the park, calls the maze. And there is a guy in there. His name is the Man in Black. Mm-hmm. And he is constantly trying to get to the center of this maze, which you get one of their main phrases, which is, the maze is not meant for you.
Or at least that was a phrase at the... Wait, it was in the beginning. So it was kind of like throughout kind of like the series. Mm-hmm. And then we got to learn that the maze was more like a consciousness, like... I don't know how to think about it. Like, it was like a way of these hosts gaining consciousness.
Right, yeah. And then, up until the newest season, right before the first season of Westworld ended, there was an all-out war breaking out between the hosts and the guests, and mm-hmm. Ford's narrative, or new narrative, which pushed a lot of the hosts to try to reach the center of the maze, mm-hmm. enabled them to kill the guests, which was not allowed before.
Yeah,
hosts were not allowed to kill the guests or any real living thing.
Right.
And then up until that point, that's how the new season of Westworld starts, which mm-hmm. is what is it? I believe Bernard is waking up on the beach.
Bernard's is being inceptioning onto the beach.
Inceptioning onto the beach, right?
And that was a very truncated. Westworld is much more larger. There's a lot of different themes and sub themes that we can go on about hours. Maybe. Hopefully, if you enjoy this content, maybe we'll think about doing a larger theory video or maybe like a recap of season 1.
Right.
But moving on to season 1. How do you what do you think about this episode going into this season? And let me preference this by saying that if you haven't seen episodes 1, 2, and 3, at this point in time we saw the first 3 episodes.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah, so spoiler alert. If we start talking about things and segments from episode 2 and 3, just keep in mind we've watched this already.
Just please take a chance to watch Westworld if you haven't. It's such a good show. I love it so much.
And then if you're not watching Westworld and you're listening to this, then I don't know what you're doing with your life.
We try to warn you.
Yeah, exactly. So spoiler alert.
This podcast was not meant for you.
So what was your big reactions for like this episode? I thought this episode was kind of like a test bed because for like the whole season as a whole, because the thing is that how are you gonna come back from a show like this where a lot of the mystery kind of gets solved, and like where do you move on from that? You know, a lot of season 1 hinges on the maze, Delores' story, Maeve's story, and this one seems like there's just a general chaos and like kind of like time, like there's missing moments in time, and we're trying to get those things from Bernard.
Well, I mean, the thing that I found really interesting is, first and foremost, the one thing that kind of I liked that they pushed on into the second season is that the disconnect between the times. Like, you don't understand which part of the story you're in. You just get kind of like a glimpse or like kind of an inkling that you are not in, it's not in chronological order. And so through the first season, it was just them telling it unchronologically, and it was through Delores.
Right.
But then once Delores reached consciousness and you just understood that everything was just kind of like set in stone and the story was there, it switched over to being Bernard, who has that whole thing with his surgery in the head not being properly fixed and stuff like that. And you, like, throughout the episode, you see that he is having some problems with his body because he's broken on the inside from that. And I like how the disconnect, or you can understand that Bernard is no longer this trusted person. He's now a narrator whose story is going in different places at different times, and he doesn't even understand where he is.
So it's a very, I guess the phrase is like he's an untrustworthy narrator.
He's in a disjoint timeline.
Yeah.
Which is really, really good for the narrative because it kind of follows the same flow as the first season.
Yeah. So like if the first season if you were in it for kind of the mystery of what this show had to offer, I think this is like the new mystery of this season, of like how much time has passed, what does this, like, how do these characters react to the aftermath, such as like the aftermath of Ford's death, or the aftermath of Logan's and the Man in Black's William's visit at Westworld, you know what I mean? So a lot of it is like trying to figure out where do these things happen in their timeline, their respective timeline.
Can I just go ahead and say really fast, that first scene with the intro with Bernard and Delores sitting, the way that it was shot was so nice.
It was so nice, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that, not a lot. There was one thing that was very, like, I took, not a negative, but I was like, what was the creative decision behind this? So, if you're not a film nerd like me or anybody else, the very first scene that you see in Westworld is shot in a different aspect ratio as all the other, as the whole show itself. You know what I mean? So
could you explain like the aspect ratio really quick before you?
I think it's shot in 16:9, so it's like it's like your theater, kind of like I would say like maybe IMAX or something.
Which is why it has the border of the top and the bottom.
It's like letterbox, and it's like widescreen, and I was thinking in my head as I was watching it, I kind of looked around at everybody else. I'm like, are we not noticing that this is in a different aspect ratio than the show was in the first season? And I was like thinking like, oh, are they gonna like, is this what the whole season gonna be, in this widescreen cinema-esque like aspect ratio, right? But it cuts back into normal like television, whatever television's aspect ratio is. So in my mind, I thought, what was the creative decision for this aspect ratio use? Because usually it's a very cinematic kind of way of showing things. You know, it's like the widescreen. But my thought was, what if this is not a memory or not anything canon to Westworld? What if this is something like constructed? What if this is like a constructed memory that Bernard has? Or what if it's not a memory that Bernard has at all, or Arnold has?
I mean, the way that I was thinking it was framed is it kind of makes it look like that almost is the most peaceful part of the show so far.
It was kind of like dreamlike in that weird way, right? A
little bit, yeah. It almost is shot so nicely that it doesn't even fit. So the way that it's filmed makes it stand out more in comparison to a lot of the other shots that they have. Yeah. And then I think if you watch the structure of the show, it'll start flashing through a whole bunch of Bernard's memories, and then it immediately just snaps into the new episodes or just into the show, just like in its regular, into its regular kind of like story.
I guess my question in this sense is that, are they ever going to go back to that aspect ratio? Are they ever going to go back and like do those things? Because I feel like as a show that does things very deliberately, I feel like there's no reason why they wouldn't do something like that again. You know
that's
what I mean?
true, yeah.
Well, like they won't do anything by accident unless it's a stock image of somebody in New York.
That stock image is great, though. Honestly,
I wonder if they use that same person in that stock photo. I think that would be awesome.
If they found her.
Well, that's the thing. It's like she everybody was like, "Hey, are you gonna be in Westworld?" And I think she was like, "I don't know what you're talking about." I guess she hasn't seen the show at that point.
Doesn't look like anything to me.
Exactly. So like, that's kind of cool. It's like imagine someone like took your picture, put it into a stock photo album or whatever, and the next you know you're on the TV show zeitgeist of like, this is the biggest TV show on anything,
right?
And now like a picture of you is on that TV show.
I feel like it would be interesting to see her, but I don't know if we'll get like a reappearance of her, because like from the narrative perspective, right? So she was the wife of William,
and also the sister of Logan,
right? And then the way that it looks like, because of like how everything is structured, it's just she's kind of like a background story. Yeah. So she acts kind of like that omniscient character, almost like Bernard's wife in a way, where you know that they're there and they exist, but you don't see a lot of them.
At least she has on-screen speaking dialogue.
The wife, but then you find out she's not real.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, so let's go off to our next topic. So from this episode. For every season of any TV show, it tells you what's going to happen and what's going on, right? From this episode, did you understand what tone this season is going to go for? You know what I mean? Or it's like, this is a very big question. Like, even I... That was part of my office falling apart.
Cut the button. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that scared me.
That scared me a bit, too. It's gay. We can fix it later.
It's just fine. I'll deal with it later. Anyway, so... God, that scared me. I was just like, what is that sound? Okay.
That scared me, too.
Yeah. Now it's on this podcast forever. Anyway, so... What the tone I get from this episode, I feel like it's... The creators of Westworld called it... It's the chaos of what had happened from Ford's death. You know, if the first season was control... Then second season is chaos. So do you get a good understanding of what that person, like Christopher Nolan's brother, his name escapes me right now, but like what they're trying to say in this?
I think so, because if you look at the first season, I feel like that idea is really personified in the characters of the hosts. So the way that they kind of hold themselves in the first season is very uptight. They kind of have like this structure to themselves. They're also following this narrative constantly, which in a sense gives you the idea like they have structure in their lives. Versus nowadays, when if you look at the characters when they go into season 2, they're breaking from their narratives. You see a lot of the hosts are kind of like walking around disjointed and shaking and all of that.
Or kind of not knowing what to do next.
Right, yeah. And then they're no longer following that loop. A prime example of this is in that new episode where I believe the man in black walks into, is it Pariah?
He walks into Pariah, and it was, I think he had a comment where it says like the story has ended, but you don't know like what to do next or something. Like this is essentially, I'm misquoting, but essentially what that scene was telling me is like your story always gets up to a point, you never see it for what it is at the end of these storylines. Right.
I find it interesting that once everyone was slaughtered, they're just sitting there, you know. Pariah is supposed to be like this place where everyone is dancing and it's celebratory.
Super
everybody's just
access, kind of like the Sin City of Westworld,
right? And then if you look at Pariah from season 1 and Pariah of season, is it 1 and 2, like the differences between them, it's like Pariah was this place where Delores went to and everybody was just like in the middle of an orgy or something like that.
Well, that's why it's a city of sin, you know
right?
what I mean?
And then now when you see it, it's just
all death.
Right. And so I find it interesting that, like, what will happen once a lot of these characters who haven't reached consciousness yet hit the end of their narrative. And a good example of this also is if you go back to season 1, when Meave runs into Hector. Is it Hector? Yeah, it's Hector. In the I think he's with Armistice and one other of his characters, like the people who...
this was the campsite scene, right?
The bank vault, yeah.
The bank vault scene.
And then once they get there, right, they're all pulling the guns on each other, and they already know that's how the narrative is supposed to end.
Or at least Meave understands where that story was going to end.
Right, because she's already hit not really hit consciousness.
Well, we're going to get back to that with the Delores comment, but I want you to finish your thought there.
Right, yeah. So once they get there, Meave comes into the campsite, and she's like... This is where you're supposed to reset. This is the end of your narrative. And then once everyone dies but Hector, she opens the vault and it's just completely empty. And he realizes that, you know, this is not the end. This is, or at least this is the end, but it was supposed to mean so much more for him when it really is just an empty vault.
Yeah, it's just an empty vault. It goes back to that story that Ford talks about. I forget who he's talking about, and I'm reminded by this when listening to the Wisecrack podcast, that like Ford was talking about like the most distressed time that he had was seeing a racing dog kill a rabbit.
Right.
And like the dog is like confused, like, well, I got this rabbit. Like the dog's whole life was trained to chase this rabbit in like this racetrack. Now that the dog has it, he doesn't know what to do with it. You know what I mean? And that and that goes into the second episode, which we should talk about in the second episode, of what El Lazo was saying about the elephant.
I mean,
anyways,
I feel like as times go on, we'll structure this a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of what the first season was talking about in Westworld was the idea of consciousness and these hosts finding consciousness. Now seeing the second season, like the idea that Delores had her own voice, like the voice in her head that was previously Ford's, previously Arnold's, or Bernard's. It's her own. But that, to me, I'm also still like thinking, is it really though? Because she's always gonna, like in the first episode of this season, she's talking to a bunch of guests and like doing that whole speech about, you know, what are your directives and stuff like that. And she goes back and forth and is like, the homesteader is saying this in the world, you know, and it's like it wants to see the best in the world, but Wyatt, and like, does that still count as consciousness? Because it's two basically different narratives battling each other. I want your opinion on that. I
mean, I feel like if you look deeply into the story of just all of the hosts in general, you can't truly say that they're free, almost, because they're kind of going to be stuck in this point where it's like there's going to be a code for every single thing that they do. Yeah. You know? But I think it's the matter of just what choices they make with those narratives. For example, the way that Delores is structured is in her season 1, or her character in season 1 is basically this innocent girl who drops a milk can in the middle of the city. And if you pick up the can, you basically are led to her narrative, which is with her father, and they get led off into the farm and stuff like that. But in season 2, I guess even in the end of season 1 as well, you see her actively choose to embrace this Wyatt character. In comparison to when Arnold programs her to shoot him. And shoot through, I think, I don't know what the town is called.
Well, the first town you see in season 1 is called Sweetwater.
I don't know if it's Sweetwater per se. But it's where the church is.
The church is in Escalante.
Okay, so Escalante.
Yeah, that's the original place.
Yeah, so I think her choosing to wear the blue dress and shooting everyone, that's an active choice that she's making to do. Because the way that she phrases it, right, is that she has a choice between being the homesteader's daughter versus the revolutionary leader Wyatt. Right. And so I think she understands that there are two narratives within her, but she's actively choosing to be Wyatt more so than she is choosing to be the old Delores that used to grow up in Sweetwater.
I guess my hang up is that I still feel Ford's influence throughout everything in this show, and that just kind of like, I guess maybe would probably lead to the idea that some hosts probably reach his consciousness while others don't. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, don't you feel like it would be interesting then to be like Ford is the embodiment of God?
So this is like an omniscient character.
Right,
that's
yeah.
always watching then.
Because think about it. Like, the way that religion works in the real world kind of
Right,
is like,
yeah.
you think that there, like, if God exists, he's
Right.
telling you through your actions that you should be doing this.
Right.
And in a way, because Ford is technically now dead,
Yeah.
he acts as the metaphorical God to all of these hosts.
Right.
And his directives are guiding them in their choices. But
Right.
even when that happens, they still have an active choice in choosing what to do, whether or not they do this, whether or not they do that, or anything like that. But the one thing I find really interesting still is that a lot of the hosts, they're kind of doing everything, but at the same time, they're kind of also like blindly following Delores right now.
Well, that especially for Teddy. At least
Yeah, Teddy.
At least Teddy's character and his MO was always to follow Delores. Mm-hmm. You know, and that was something from season 1 where it always been this directive he has in his mind.
Right, yeah. But I feel like Teddy's narrative coming into season 2 will be very interesting to see. Just because just as much as Delores has like a kind of conflict within her narrative, he also has a conflict within his narratives, which is he's constantly supposed to be protecting Delores, like the frail, fragile Delores who lived in Sweetwater, and he was supposed to be her
Kind of like damsel in distress.
yeah, and
situation.
he'd be like the knight in shining armor almost. But now that the narratives are a little bit different, he's kind of like still following her, but understands that he should technically be killing Wyatt, or the character that she is embracing now, and it's a vast difference.
I find that very interesting. Is that like Delores is Wyatt, and there's at least 2 people I know in this series that, like it's Teddy and Armistice that has the directive of to kill Wyatt. So it will be interesting to kind of see like where those things are gonna start to lie, because at the end of the episode, what we see as Teddy is in the water. You know what I mean? Dead in the water. So it'll be interesting further down the line to see what happens in those flashbacks, like the 12-day kind of like situation going on there. To move this podcast forward, Meave has left the train, so we get to see the aftermath of that.
Yep.
And I guess something I have in mind is that is Meave and Delores on equal footing at this point? Before I talk about anything else that I want to talk about with Meave, is Meave on the same consciousness level as Delores?
I'm not sure anymore. With season 1, you get a sense that like Meave is on this like huge story to consciousness, and you see how she like tries to do that by redirecting herself, telling Sylvester and Felix like, hey, you're under my control now, you're doing whatever I want you to do.
Yeah.
But then at the end of season 1, you get like this eye-opener twist that it's not really her being awake, it's a narrative that Ford programmed into her to cause a distraction
from the gala event.
Right, yeah. And so I don't know anymore. I mean, to some degree, I feel like she is on the same level as Delores now, but that's mainly because she's embracing her will to want to go find her daughter that was in her past narrative.
Well, that goes into our conversation we had before, where we were talking about how much like there's a lot of like human impulses that these hosts still have. So like the impulse to go back to family, the impulse to respect parents and father figures, and like the impulse to find a daughter, you know what I mean? The emphasis on that, like, does that mean Maeve's conscious, you know what I mean? Because her main directive was to infiltrate the mainland, right? And that we saw that at the end of season 1, right? She stays away from that to find her daughter, you know what I mean? So maybe yes or no, she reaches consciousness, but I would find it interesting at the end of this season is like if she finds her daughter and finds out that she's been programmed to love a different mother, how much she's going to react to that. You know what I mean? Because her MO was to leave or get out of Westworld, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now her MO is to find her daughter in this season.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if she's not reached consciousness, her new consciousness probably journey is to find her daughter, and then whatever she does once she realizes that truth, maybe she gets conscious.
Well, here's the thing. I feel like now that we're talking about it, I feel like we have to think about consciousness in a different way for the hosts. Because for us, right, it's understanding our, well, actually it's kind of the same as us. It's understanding our reality. Mm-hmm. And so the way that the hosts are kind of like framed in the film or in the show is that if you don't understand that you're a host and there's another world to everything, you're not truly conscious. Right. That's from what you can tell from Meave, what you can tell from Delores. And the way that they reached consciousness is, one, understanding that they have past lives and different narratives in their kind of like back storyline. And then on top of that, understanding that there is a higher being who is making them and creating a whole bunch of these different hosts in the first place.
Right.
So I feel like the way that we have to think about consciousness in terms of Westworld is that it's not necessarily breaking narratives. It's more so understanding the reality of who you are as a host.
So in this case, Delores understanding that this park was meant for the quote-unquote the guests to rape, kill, have sex with all these like different hosts.
That understanding that there is another world outside
of Westworld.
Outside of Westworld, understanding that their higher beings are basically just people who are reprogramming them, putting them back into their narratives,
right,
and setting them back forth onto their merry way.
Yeah, kind of like repairing them.
Basically, yeah.
I find it crazy, not really crazy. I find it interesting that Delores is killing a bunch of humans, right? We're not led to believe that hosts can heal other hosts unless you're Meave, right? So wouldn't that just means that Delores is just like putting a crutch, on themselves? Like,
a little bit.
Like there's not anybody to repair these hosts.
Right.
Yeah. At least we know from this first episode.
I mean, I think the way that it's kind of structured right now, it shows the finality of both the hosts and the guests, right? Because for the hosts, there's no longer someone who can fix them. They're just kind of like dead bodies as soon as they get shot, which is how they've always been generally.
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, they're not going to put back into the story. They're not going to put back into the narratives. Everyone in Westworld is basically dead if you're working above.
I guess for both employees, guests, and hosts. Then.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it definitely shows the finality of just like the actual guests of Westworld because the fact that the hosts can shoot
people
and kill them, which is mind-boggling, but also amazing. It shows how they're just as weak as the people that are made for their entertainment.
Yeah. So let's sort of wrap this up in the next 2 or 3 questions. So we talked about this episode. We're focusing on Delores and we're focusing on Meave. We haven't talked about or touched on the Man in Black.
Ah, yeah.
So the Man in Black's situation now is that there is a new narrative for him made by Ford.
Right.
And it's called like what, Find the Door or something like that.
I don't know if it actually has a narrative per se, but I think it's
Boy Ford.
Boy Ford.
Boy.
No.
Boy Ford tells him that your next objective is to find the door, and apparently we're led to believe that the Man in Black understood what that meant, and gives like a cryptic phrase where it's like the story ends where it begins, and the only way out is through the beginning or something like that, and you must find the door.
Right.
I'm wildly misquoting it, but that's what I got from it. Yeah.
I find it interesting that that Ford kind of in his own personal way kind of put the Man in Black on his own maze, because it's kind of like answering the Man in Black's constant question of like, why is it that this maze is not meant for me? He didn't understand that in the first season, so he was constantly trying to look for it. Going into, I think, the parks. I mean, he even cut off I don't know his name, but he did cut off like one of the table. You know how they have like gambling tables and stuff like that?
Oh, Kissy, right?
Yeah, and
at the first season, yeah,
he cut off his
Kissy's
head,
scalp.
and then you see the maze in there, which is interesting now that I think about it, because we've seen that with two people now. We have it with Kissy, and we have it with the Ghost Nation
guy.
So we know that that's all under the skull or the craniums.
Yeah, and the scalp of these hosts. Yeah,
right, which is kind of like, it makes sense.
Yeah,
because it's their consciousness, right? But I do find it interesting that it's kind of like, with how much the Man in Black was going through season 1, being like trying to look for the maze and looking to see if he could reach the center of it, and finally understanding it wasn't for him.
Right.
Then he finally gets this whole entire game made by Ford for him.
Yeah. I like the idea that this whole like find the door thing is like, hey, find the exit, see if you survive. Good luck.
Okay, thanks, bye.
Yeah, it's just like, fuck you, William. It's like, you made me open this park. Now these hosts reach consciousness. Good luck. Try to stay alive.
Really quick question though. Do you think Ford knew that Delores would kind of shoot him in the back of the head? Right? Because it's interesting how Ford and Arnold / Bernard have kind of like the same death scene, which is actually then it's Arnold, but they have Delores.
Yeah, Delores is the one that pulled the trigger. I think this could be like a bigger discussion on like maybe a big episode of season 1. But if I were to like, I guess, gun to my head sort of conversation, I would say that was like a programmed moment. I want to think, because how would Ford know Delores would shoot Ford? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I was thinking, it's like, because it's tough to say, like, was that decision to kill Ford her decision, or what Ford programmed for her, or maybe it's part of the Wyatt programming? Like, at what point is she actually acting on her own free will in that specific moment of killing Ford?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The way that I understood it was kind of like the way that it parallels each other. So you have Ford, and then you have Arnold. And Arnold he programmed Wyatt into her to shoot him. But then the way that Ford died was that he gave her everything like on a silver platter, and then she kind of chose to, so it kind of parallels each other. Anyways, back to
but I kind of like, forward your thought. Maybe the idea of choices, like these hosts have now choices. I feel like if it wasn't programmed in her, maybe that was like a choice, or maybe like, say like you have a new set of tools. Maybe this is like a host way of saying like, oh, can I really kill a human? You know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
I guess maybe that was like the idea that was set forth in this kind of like what Ford was doing. Yeah,
that makes sense. But back to the Man in Black though.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting that in the newest episode, you see him go into Pariah, and then he goes in with, I believe it's Lawrence, right? And then he walks in and he talks to the guy, and then he's like, "You're meant to play this game by yourself."
Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing of what the Man in Black storyline is right now, is that it's his story to fulfill, and it's not a story for the host to fulfill, I guess. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I'm hoping that Ed Harris survives in this season.
That'd be nice to see him back in the next couple of episodes or so.
Yeah. I want to know what this door means, even though in my mind I probably feel like I probably answered it for myself. It's the exit. Try to survive, bitch. It's like all those years of you telling me to do all these things for you and your guests. It's like now the rules have turned, and you're gonna have to survive out of this park.
Or just like Spartan kicks the door. Are you not entertained?
Exactly. Just a whole Russell Crowe moment. Okay. And just last point for this episode, we're gonna wrap up on time now. Is what is that lake or sea at the end? Did they call it a sea or a lake?
Oh, the lake. I think it's a lake.
Yeah. So how did that lake get there? And what is this whole idea about Valley Beyond? You know what I mean? And Bernard apparently says is like, I killed them all. You know what I mean? So what does that mean? At least from this episode on. You know what I mean?
The honest answer is I have no idea.
I guess part of it is the joy of this mystery of like, where is this going? Why is there a bunch of hosts in the middle of like an ocean? You know what I mean?
I do find it interesting also that like if you look at how it's shown, right?
Right.
Delores throughout season 2 has been going, you were not meant to go to the Valley Beyond.
Right.
And then
what she said.
kills them.
Yeah.
But I do see how it could play into the plot where, you know how there's a lake, right?
Right.
And currently the way that they show it in season 2 is that the lake is filled with bodies.
Yeah.
It is in a valley.
Yeah.
So it could be that as they're traveling down wherever this lake goes, those are the people that did not make it to the Valley Beyond. Maybe Delores made it through there. Maybe Meave did. Who knows? But it'd be interesting to see if maybe there was like a big thing that happened there, and then those were just the people that got left behind. Or maybe she like Spartan kicked people off the hills. Who knows? But
well, if she Spartan kicks, there's no reason why she couldn't do that for Ghost Nation.
just Spartan kicks. This is Westworld.
I just got like the mental image of like Delores and
the
like
slow-mo with Teddy just falling over the side.
like with ripped abs.
I mean, that's technically what she is, except she's kind of like holding 2 guns on the side of her arms and going like, you ready to die, bitch?
Exactly. So I guess this is probably a question to answer in the next couple episodes. So thanks for listening to this podcast, or it's probably just kind of like maybe like a review or something like that.
I think as time will go on, we'll try to structure it a little bit more, and then see if maybe as the episodes come out, we can focus specifically on the episodes. But I think right now it's good that we talked about like a variety of things.
Should we really put reviews on of this, like kind of like number reviews? I feel like I would rather, instead of reviews, be like, oh, it was a good episode, or this wasn't a very great episode, but there's stuff that works. So
I think if anything, the best way to go about it could be just looking at the episode and seeing how it ties in with a lot of the pre-existing,
like as a whole,
with the pre-existing stories that have been established within Westworld already, and seeing how far it can go and how far Lisa Joy and I forgot the other guy's name.
I think it's Lisa Joy.
It's not Joss Whedon. No?
Yeah, I know it's Joss Whedon. Yeah, but we'll make sure we get that right in the next episode. But I don't know. On a personal level, I don't necessarily like putting numbers on it because it gives like a connotation of like, oh, if this has X amount of numbers, then it's not worth watching. But if somebody like me or somebody else is like, hey, but I love Jumanji back as a kid and as an adult, I still like it, but it still has a Rotten Tomato score of like less than 60, like. Try stop people from watching it, even though like, you know, it's the whole idea in my mind about doing these things is like, let's celebrate things that we like,
right?
So,
yeah.
Anyways, so whether we do or not, you'll see in the next couple episodes. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the next couple episodes, and hope you enjoyed enough though so we could do like maybe an hour episode on the first season or something. All right,
maybe.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.